Welcome to this second scene-setting panel of the Clingendael State of the Union Conference. My name is Monica C. I'm the General Director of the Clingendael Institute, and next to me is Sjousje Martin. She's one of the talented researchers of our team. The theme of this panel is the great power context in which we develop our European narratives. And by narratives, we mean the stories that countries tell, where we've come from and where we go to, what we stand for. In this panel, we pay extra attention to the great power context about where the world is heading and how these great powers see Europe's role. Our thesis is that increasing great power assertiveness is adding urgency to the assignment for Europe to reflect on what it stands for and how it sees the future global order. We have just had a full-blown exposure to the Chinese narrative through Professor Zhang Weiwei from the Fudan University. So we have time in this panel to reflect on that Chinese vision of the European model and of the Chinese politically self-conscious narrative. Xiao.
And that is why in this panel, we will discuss the role of geopolitics and narratives with an outstanding panel of 4 panelists and a concluding columnist, Ties Dams, my colleague. We will discuss in depth what the key elements are of Chinese and American narratives and how these two great powers see Europe in their respective narratives. We will then reflect on the European narrative in this great power context and on how China, the US, and Europe see or should see the strategic finality that is the future global order. Do we foresee a battle of narratives with the pursuit of dominance by the great powers, Americans or the Chinese? Or do we foresee and prefer to make the world safe for diversity, in the words of JFK? Is that preferable or is that just naive? Let me first start with a brief question and introduce our 4 panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Frans-Paul van der Putten, senior researcher at Clingendael and head of the China Center at Clingendael. A question to you, Frans-Paul. What role do you see for narratives in contemporary Chinese politics?
I think in the Chinese political system, narratives are extremely important, at least in 2 ways. One is in the domestic scene, where the political narrative is an important tool that the Communist Party has to make sure that it is legitimized, that it continues to retain its legitimacy among the Chinese population. So it's important for the party to tell a story that appeals to the Chinese people. At the same time, there's also the foreign policy side, the external side of China, where the political narrative is an important instrument for the Chinese government to create an external environment that is conducive to Chinese interests, that suit Chinese interest in the sphere of both the economy and its national security.
Thank you, Frans-Paul. Let me introduce our second panelist, Dr. Paul van Hooft, Senior Analyst at HCSS. Paul has also been a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, where his work focuses on the origins and the logic of American grand strategy. Paul, a question for you. How important are narratives in American grand strategy?
Hi, thank you for the invitation. No, I think narratives are immensely important for US grand strategy, US foreign policy. I think they are important for all countries, right? And there's I think a tendency to push narratives as just being, instrumental, just being used to sell foreign policy. But I think they're more substantial than that. Now, US policymakers do need to explain to domestic audience, why the United States should play a role in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, why that serves their interests. But narratives do more than that. They have more than this public side. They also have a private side, and they have an internal and external side. They're basically a story to tie together why states do what they do. And there's quite a lot of research that shows that US officials have used these kind of narratives also in private, where to make grand strategic decisions. You think of things like NSC 68, or during Vietnam, or during the Iraq War. But I think that also points us to the other elements, that narratives can also trap us, right? Because at some point, like in Vietnam or Afghanistan, at some point they also, they can bounce against and they can clash with structural changes. But I think in general, for the US being so far away from the rest of the world, it needs a good story to explain why it's everywhere on the planet and why that's important to it.
Thank you, Paul. And that brings us to our third panelist, Dr. Elchardus, Emeritus Professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, the Free University, and author and columnist of Belgian newspaper De Morgen. Question for Mark: is it useful that Europe, with all its diversity, strives for an umbrella narrative that includes the different countries, or is this an impossible task?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this event. Well, I think developing a European narrative is a daunting but almost inevitable task. There is ample research from the practical side that shows that developing in countries, despite their diversity, a sense of common destiny, of common purpose, a sense of community, has a lot of advantages. It makes them economically more performative. It makes for less violence and less repression. It makes government more effective. So it's something very important to do. And developing a narrative is, of course, a necessary part of trying to create a sense of community. What the narrative finally always comes down to is the creation discursively of a we. And then, as Monica indicated in the introduction, answering the questions: where do we come from? Where do we stand? Where are we heading? What are we striving for? And it seems to me that that is almost inevitable, that it's necessary to do that. And there's also evidence that indicates that this is the case, because when serious historians stopped writing national histories and national narratives, less serious ones immediately filled the void, took over. So it seems to me it's something inevitable. But as your question indicates, there are, of course, many people in Europe who think that developing a European narrative is not necessary or even undesirable alongside the existing national narratives. But here again, the inevitable shows itself. There is an emerging European narrative. So to me, this emerging European narrative, I think this is the occasion for this conference, is now surrounded by a sense of urgency. So to me, the question is not so much whether we have to develop such a narrative, but the question rather is, how do we do that successfully?
Thank you, Mike. And then finally, we are delighted that Karin Mössenlechner, Director for Asia and Oceania at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will be able to join us. Karin, could you add your perspective on the importance of a Dutch narrative in this geopolitical and European context?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me as well to this very important panel on narratives in geopolitics and great power narratives. I think narratives play an important role in geopolitics, and an increasingly important role, because we're living in a complex world, and I think there's a growing need for people to understand this world and understandable speak in words and in stories. Many of the great players in this world are making use of that need of people also to come with their narratives. And we see very strong narratives. Unfortunately, I could not witness the presentation that was just given by the Chinese narrative writer, Mr. Zhang, but Chinese are very strong and getting much stronger all the time, actually, in creating this narrative. We've heard also that Americans are very strong in their narratives, and I think that already started with the first narrative, The Great City Upon the Hill. Europe has never been actually as good as in creating its own narrative, and I think that is an urgent need also for the Netherlands. I mean, you talk about a Dutch narrative. Of course, the Netherlands has its own narratives as well. And our narrative started with maybe with Hansje Brinker, the country below the sea and the land of pioneers. And we were the land of discoverers and innovators, and many things that we could say about our own narratives that we used to have in the past. Also important ones like the Euro brochures, the country of international law. But in the end, when you're talking about great power narratives that really have an impact also in actually directing the world and the world vision, of course, the Netherlands is not a player. And if we want to be part of a narrative where we can actually have influence in the world, we need, and I fully agree with the previous speaker, a European narrative. If we're talking among ourselves in the Netherlands, Minister of Foreign Affairs, we're often talking about the importance of a European narrative. And as Director Asia, I can also definitely see the need of working together as a European Union and among each other to also work at a stronger actually vision of where we want to, how we want to present ourselves, where do we want to head to as Europe, also in the context in relation to the Indo-Pacific. And the Asian part of this world. So it's very important that we as Netherlands not only think about our own narrative. As a small player, we have to be modest, but we have to think what are the narratives that fits best.
Thank you, Karin, and thanks for this first round, stressing the urgency of European narratives. Frans-Paul, maybe we can go a little bit more in depth. We had the special opportunity to have this full exposure to the Chinese narrative. In the previous session, when we discussed with Professor Zhang Weiwei, what were your first reflections on that discussion on the Chinese narrative, Frans-Paul?
I think Professor Zhang Weiwei did a very good job to explain to a non-Chinese audience the Chinese narrative, the story that China is promoting about itself, about its role in the world. And I think a few things that struck me. One is the emphasis that Professor Zhang put on the comparison between systems. So he said that actually the Chinese system is working very well, whereas the Western system is becoming outdated and needs a revision. So this implies that there's a kind of a hierarchy between systems. Not all systems are not equally performing well. So this is something that apparently is apart from the question whether there is one system that is the most suitable system also for other countries, even within the national setting or regional setting that countries have. Some systems perform better than others. So this is a point that he made. Another point that he made was about the future of the international order and the insistence that China will never impose its own model on other countries. And I think when we talk about narratives and geopolitics, this is a very fundamental question for us Europeans that China is putting on the table. I think it has two sides to it. One is, let's say, the proposal that in fact China has made, and that Professor Zhang Weiwei just also articulated in his presentation, is that we can have let's say, a peaceful coexistence in this world, in one global system, as long as countries do not try to impose their values onto other countries. And then he said, this is something that China has been suffering from because it's Westerners that have been doing this, but China itself will never do this. And of course, for us Europeans, a question that we need to address for ourselves is, can we actually live in a world where we accept human rights situations in other countries that go against our values? Can we actually just accept that and leave it as it is? And the other one is, will a powerful China, an increasingly powerful China, will it indeed not, start to impose its own values onto other countries? Can we trust China when it says this? And I think one of the basic mechanisms of geopolitics is that countries, especially great powers, do not, it's not enough to have verbal guarantees that something will not happen in the future. There needs to be more. There needs to be more fundamental system underneath of this.
Yeah, Thanks so much, Frans-Paul. And you put at the table the two existential questions where it comes to this future coexistence of civilizations, the strategic finality, so to say. On the one hand, if China will become more dominant, will it reverse its narrative, its strategy to not impose its model on those inferior living societies? And on the other hand, will Europe pursue the foreign policy of, for instance, Josep Borrell, who said in a meeting, in a webinar, so even that I participated in, that the core of Europe's foreign policy is to change the domestic policy of other states. So it's not to protect the interests of Europe, but it's to change the Chinese domestic policies. So that is not boding well where it comes to coexistence and live and let live that Zhang Weiwei promoted. Now, of course, it becomes crucial what our first assessments are. Are we moving towards this peaceful coexistence, or are we not? Do you, as an analyst, see early warnings that China, as it becomes more dominant, might not pursue this declaratory strategy?
Well, I think in the 1980s, the Chinese government came up with the idea of one country, two systems as a proposal for the reunification between Taiwan and mainland China. And then this model was actually implemented in the return of both Hong Kong and Macau to Chinese rule in the 1990s. So when we look at Hong Kong, and there the concept of one country, two systems has been put in practice. I think from the perspective, from our Western perspective, and probably also from the Hong Kong population perspective, this model is gradually eroding. So the limitations on Hong Kong society to maintain its own system within the framework of the People's Republic of China is diminishing. So this raises an important question: is that indeed happening in Hong Kong, and is that indeed is this an indication that China might also be less tolerant towards let's say more liberal societies outside of China in the future? Or is it a special case because it's Hong Kong and it's part of the, that I have to say, we're in an early stage. That is quite difficult to say so far, but it is an indication that we have to, of course, take into account.
Stay aware. And when you look at the European side, it struck me that Professor Zhang was making a distinction between the European Parliament that still has to learn, because it's so focused on human rights, etc., and the other institutions like the European Council, who has performed in a more mature manner in its relationship to China. Very interesting. Do you see this foreign policy strategy of Borrell and the European Parliament evolving? Do you expect any restraint where it comes to human rights in the future, or will this remain at the center of foreign policies of Europe?
I think in Europe, European Union-China relations, human rights have been taking up a very important place already since 1989, since the big Tiananmen crisis and demonstrations and the violent way the demonstrations were ended in China. But I think over the past few years and very recently, I think the role of human rights in European Union-China relations is actually growing. It's becoming even a bigger part, a more central part of the relationship. And if we go back to the point that we discussed just before, I think it's a very fundamental discussion that I think Europe needs to face. It's not a debate with China, but it is our own internal debate whether a future global order in which there are guarantees that China will not interfere with our values, would that be, would we be willing to, in order to obtain such a future, not to interfere in China on the basis of our values? So that means the human rights policy would then come under severe pressure.
Something to deeply reflect on quite a question. Frans-Paul, maybe, thank you. Maybe I can move to Paul van Hooft. Paul, you have studied American grand strategy and narratives, and what have been the key elements in the American narrative grand strategy as you have lived in it?
Right. Well, I mean, to paraphrase Tolstoy, I guess all great powers have a narrative of exceptionalism, but they're all exceptional in their own way. And I think the US narrative is an interesting one because in many ways it would seem very familiar to European audiences, the strategic narrative for its role in the world, but it's distinct in very important ways. So I think the narrative very openly during the Cold War, but maybe even especially since the end of the Cold War, has been one of promoting democracy, open markets, and stability in the form of dampening regional competitions, inhibiting the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And this is presented as a virtuous circle, right? So democracies don't fight with each other, therefore we would have more security. Open markets strengthen democracy and also remove the incentives for conflict. By providing security in the international system, it's possible to have prosperity, to have free trade. So this is a virtuous circle where every element kind of reinforces itself. Now, what I've just said is essentially the democratic peace theory, and I think to most of the audience it would seem familiar. It even seems intuitively attractive, I assume, right? It's in the way I just described. In many ways, most Europeans would share the same view, or at least they certainly shared that view for the last several decades. Yet there is the important difference, and that is that in the US way of thinking about these things, it is not really possible to be secure unless these trends are all moving in that direction in the rest of the world. Right? And that is a narrative that is not post-Cold War. That is a narrative that's not even really exclusively Cold War. You see elements of it before. You see elements of it even before the US engaged with European politics in World War I and World War II. Right? And you can argue that it's more of a democratic peace theory on steroids. So the US has an indispensable role to play as an enforcer of that order. Right? Indispensable nation was the phrasing that Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, used in the late 90s. But President Obama used America must lead by example, and Biden last year at this point? Yes, it's last year, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, and it's a theme that he's picked up since, is that America must lead.
Must lead.
And literally the statements are always, if America must lead, because if we don't, nobody else will. And that is an important difference. And this idea that events on the other side of the world, and remember, which is also hard to imagine, I think, for Europeans, but for the US, in very real terms, everything that happens geopolitically essentially is on the other, very, very far away from US territory. Right? Everything outside of the Western Hemisphere is removed from the US by massive oceans. So I think that also explains, it's not exclusively instrumental, but that explains why there has to be a very strong narrative that gives US policymakers, the public, a reason to care so much about the rest of the world. And I've tried to write about that as well in my own work.
So, and what you say actually is that the idea about the strategic finality has already been developed in the United States, whereas in the European Union, there's still some doubt. Could there be coexistence of civilizations? Do we need hegemony of the United States to be secure in the United States? Do you see any debate about a shared number one position, for instance? If this could be possible, could there be peace, security with a shared number one position shared by China and the US, or does America has to lead for peaceful coexistence?
Right. So I think that's a good question, because this is precisely where you see an increasing tension within among US policymakers, among the US public. The mainstream, the vast majority, I think, is still focused on the US leading. Opinion polls show much the same, although there's certainly a declining view that the US must lead among younger generations. However, in the last 10 years or so, we can see that this idea has been under increased critique and attack from different parts of the political spectrum, right? Now, Trump is an obvious exception to the argument. Now, it's an argument about, Trump's argument about foreign policy was one essentially about power. It's about domination, but it wasn't one about those values per se, right? And I think and that sort of goes back to long tradition in US domestic politics and international politics, that's kind of a more straightforward nationalist populist argument. Some people have called the Jacksonian tradition.
Yeah.
But, and that certainly has nothing to do with keeping free markets open and all that. Now, there's also an attack from the right side of the political spectrum, which is a more libertarian one, which you can see kind of encapsulated in the Charles Koch Foundation, for example. And that libertarian argument says, well, yes, we're wasting money on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world can and should figure out what it wants to do, but we would like to keep, a free trade system, and certain international institutions are just fine.
Yeah.
And then there's a critique from the left side of the spectrum, and these are all, I think, much stronger than they have been for decades, which you would say, let's say the Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez kind of corner of the Democratic Party, which says, well, what the US has done is essentially borderline or blatant imperialism, and we're wasting resources, we're wasting lives, and we're doing horrible things, and therefore we should not do this. But that corner is probably more skeptical again as well about the free trade over everything kind of approach. So this idea is under stress. And it's also interesting to see what will happen after this presidency, because in many ways, to be blunt, Biden is not really, is not really someone for the future. Is not going to offer a long-term perspective.
Thank you so much for sketching that strategic landscape, Paul. Very meaningful. That brings me to Mark Elchardus to discuss the European narrative in this big power context. Mark, the difference, of course, between China and the US on the one hand and Europe on the other hand is that the EU is not a nation. And do you see, nonetheless, an umbrella narrative developing at European level?
Yes, and generally speaking, it has a very predictable form. It lists a number of values: freedom, equality, and a number of institutions, democracy, rule of law, and which are considered not necessarily exclusive for Europe, but distinctive of Europe. And then the narrative unfolds. On the one hand, one can say internationally by saying how those values guide our geopolitics. That's rather recent, and there's not so much of that. And the narrative in the past has particularly developed on the basis of the argument respect for those values and for the integrity of those institutions is crucial for achieving the goals we all share, for achieving the goals that are widely shared. And this general form might be predictable, but it still is specific. It means that the option is taken to define the specificity of Europe in terms of values and institutions. And that's a specific choice. If one reads, for instance, Professor Zhang, one has the impression that the Chinese narrative doesn't opt for a definition in terms of institutions, but much more in terms of ancient practices. A phrase that regularly recurs is, we have been doing that for thousands of years. It's the practices that count.
Yeah. And do you see weaknesses of the emerging narrative, of the European narrative? For instance, where it comes to our identity, our collective identity?
Yes, I think I see particularly three weaknesses, and they concern history and identity and diversity.
Hmm.
And I'll be very brief about the historical dimension, but when one reads the text in which this European narrative is emerging, one is struck by the fact that it's almost as if Europe emerged in 1950 with the Treaty
Exactly,
of Rome.
yeah.
While if one takes at all the option of defining the specificity of Europe in terms of values and institutions, it's very, very important to sketch how they emerged in the course of history and how they were surrounded by discussions and how they still are surrounded by discussion. I think that should be part of our identity. And that means that you look at how this civilizational space emerged, and that concerns the last couple of thousand years and not the last 70 years. And also the identity is somewhat of a problem, because if the text in which those values and institutions are emphasized very often have a somewhat haphazard character. There is a listing of some values, equality, freedom, the listing of some institutions, democracy, rule of law, and then the rights, very important, the human rights. But I think if one at all takes the option of using institutions to define your identity, and I think that makes sense, because institutions in a way are the interface between values and practices and legislation. And then institutions are attractive for Europe, I think, because some have emerged in this continent, or part of European civilization, as still distinctive. And I would list at least 7 of them as very important for the European identity. And that is the popular sovereignty, rule of law, and citizenship based on equality, which together we usually call democracy, and then the welfare state and the secular state, and science as the public form of knowledge and the basis of economic activity, and the relatively important role of the state in economic affairs. I think those are the institutions, and we should start from those institutions and then say what they imply.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to give in a nutshell the European narrative. We can end the conference here. If it were not the case that there is general consensus maybe on these institutions, broadly speaking, but the moment we start implementing or making rule of law concrete, for instance, in the Hungarian case, the Polish case, it becomes less pleasant. So there is consensus maybe on these institutions, but not so much on what they mean in practice, in the practice of the member states. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. That's what I meant with this third criticism, which concerns diversity. And diversity in 2 dimensions. Is one of the great challenges of any national narrative, and also a narrative for the European Union. You always have to deal with the internal diversity in the country, and your narrative should not be too exclusive or certainly not repressive with regard to certain groups. And on the other hand, you have to deal with the diversity in the world without becoming an imperialist. And our narratives, or institutions, deal with a lot of diversity, but not with this one you refer to. Because if we look at each of those institutions, it's clear that conservatives and progressives, the left and the right, liberals and communitarians, nationalists and cosmopolitans, don't look at the same way at those institutions, right? We share those institutions in Europe, and that's very important, but we should admit, we should be aware of the fact that not everybody has the same vision of how those institutions are then translated into legislation. It's clear that not all European majorities in the nation states, and I don't mean only political majorities, but simply what the majority of the people is thinking. Well, not everybody in those European states has the same view of LGBTQ rights, of how they should be translated into national legislation. And you refer to it in your question. There is tension between the East and the West of the European Union of how exactly popular sovereignty and the rule of law should relate to each other. So I think it's very important for a European narrative, and I think this is very crucial, that it at the same time emphasizes the importance of those common institutions and accommodates the fact that we don't agree exactly on how they should be translated into legislation. We should have room for that kind of diversity, and that distinguishes us from, for instance, a Chinese narrative. Narratives of non-democratic societies tend to over-homogenize the legacy of their past and the values of their people, and that is what a European narrative should not do.
I see some contrast with the view of Professor Zhang, who was pleading for more unification on this point, rather the opposite. Thanks so much for your reflections, Mark. And we're delighted that in addition to these wise academics, we also have Karin Mössenlechner here to add strategic reflections, from political practice. Karin, welcome again. And you're director for Asia Oceania at the Dutch MFA. Your predecessor has developed the Dutch China note. What were the main strategic takeaways of that note? Maybe just to remember that for the audience.
Yes, we're talking about the Dutch, indeed, China strategy, as we sometimes call it, which was developed 2.5 years ago. And it was developed exactly for actually the discussion that we're having, because the world is changing. We see major shifts in global paradigms and geopolitical power. And we see also more and more actually challenges in dealing with this new world order. And one, of course, the main changes is the rise of China, and that we have to actually find a way of how do we position ourselves towards China. There are many, as I said, challenges that we're facing, and it was raised already in the discussion before, concerns in Parliament, but also in society about human rights, which is an important issue, but also the impact on our international order, which is changing. I hear another voice. But I hope you don't hear the same echo that I hear now.
I'm trying to solve it, Karin.
Okay, thank you. I think it is gone now, but we see, of course, also the impact on the international order, on our open economy and level playing fields, and so we have to formulate an answer to that. We had to formulate an answer to that, and as the Netherlands, we came up with our China policy paper, which actually said that, well, in our relationship with China, we have to cooperate where we can, but we have to protect our own interests and values where we must. And that is actually still the basis for our relationship to China. I think we're still looking at the ways how can we cooperate, and there are many areas where we not only want to cooperate, but we have to cooperate when it comes to issues like climate. Well, it's clear that we cannot deal with climate challenges without China. So there are many issues where we want to cooperate with China, but we also have to be more aware of certain risks in dealing with China, and be more forthcoming also, and talk more about our own values and our own interests, and stand up for our own interests. And that was actually the basis. And I've seen a main shift, actually, where 2 years ago, I think, in the public domain, we were talking more about raising awareness of the changes in geopolitics. I think now the awareness is there, and we're really now talking about finding a modus, dealing with a new reality.
And since its publication, that is now 2.5 years ago, there has been a pandemic. In the meantime, China has really further developed. The narrative has been even more clear to the world. There have been human rights sanctions, etc. Do you where do you feel the tension in this note? You say it can still be the context of our policies, and I can understand that because indeed you cooperate where it must with global challenges, and at the same time you're not naive. But yeah, do you feel tensions in parts of the strategy, and where are they?
Yeah, well, I think you already mentioned, I think that the cooperation part has become more difficult, and it has become more difficult to find the areas where we can cooperate. At the same time, I think one of the goals that we also spelled out in the China strategy paper was, and in policy paper was, to work closer together with other European countries. Mm-hmm. And there I see a lot has changed also in the past 2 years. And whereas 2.5 years ago, everyone was actually, all the European member states were more or less dealing with these challenges on their own. I think now we have much more a common approach. Despite all the challenges were just mentioned also by the previous speaker, by Mark, and all the diversity that we still have, mm-hmm. which is also, I fully agree, part of our strength. We see much more convergence in European positioning there. And I think we've also, as European Union, come quite a long way in realizing that we have to engage more. I mean, not less, but we have to engage more in an inclusive manner with the whole of the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm very glad that, well, also thanks to what we initiated as Netherlands together with Germany and France, we now have an Indo-Pacific strategy for the European Union. We have a much more actually active outreach to the region. And I think it is important that as part of that outreach, we also now start looking more at what is the narrative as a European Union that we want to use towards the countries in the region. And one of the things I want to say is that I think it is very important that we don't let ourselves be trapped in I just read the farewell interview of Christopher Heusgen, was a foreign policy advisor of Angela Merkel. And I fully agree. I've been saying that myself the whole time. So we should not let ourselves be trapped in the framing of West against China or West against Asia or West against the rest. I think that is something that we should very much abolish, that kind of thinking. We have to look at where can we work together, and what areas are the areas that we can work together with what partners. And some partners also in the Asia region very much share our same interests in human rights, in a rules-based international order. And we have to link up with these countries in these areas. With China, we can work together in other areas. For instance, what I mentioned in climate change, but also the area of trade, sustainability, there are areas where we can work together as well. So we have to find a new approach to the region, and we're very much redefining ourselves, I think, also as Europe.
Well, thanks. Yeah, of course. Yeah, one part where we've seen tensions is the human rights domain, where the Dutch Parliament, but also the European Parliament, has been very vocal, demanding for renewal or an extra chapter or a renewing chapter of the China strategy. They even called the treatment of the Uyghur in Xinjiang genocide. There have been sanctions. One of the Dutch parliamentarians has been, the Chinese focused in their counter sanctions on this parliamentarian. How does the Dutch government maneuver in this escalation process? How to remain a cooperation partner when this is going on with this so-called systemic rival?
Yes. Yeah, well, as I said, it is becoming more difficult, and indeed we're trying to deal with China in different facets. And the European strategic outlook has described it as China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to look at China in all the ways together. It's both a partner that we need for global challenges. It is a competitor in an economic area, And it's also in many ways a systemic rival and not sharing the same views that we have. And as I said, unfortunately, I missed the presentation of Mr. Zhang, but I can imagine what was said there. And of course, there are many differences also in approach, in worldview, in values, and that is of course becoming more challenging. And I listened to the discussion you had with Frans-Paul about how are you going to actually actually combine this the area of systemic rival, and how are you going to find actually a way to deal with that? Because of course that is the big challenge we're facing. Are we in the end willing to accept that China has a different system, and are we not going to interfere with it? I don't think that it's for us possible not to address human rights violations when they occur. It's so much ingrained in our DNA, and it's so much part of who we are, of our identity, and what we think is important. So we try to continue to have this dialogue with China on human rights. At the same time, we want to find a way not to do it always in a very confrontational way or in a one-dimensional way, only looking at China through the human rights prism. We have to look at China as a multifaceted country, and we have to deal with China in all its aspects, and not just let our position towards China be solely actually determined by our human rights concerns.
Thanks for giving this insight in your complicated, fascinating daily work, Karin. It's time now to involve the public in the Zoom call. Xiaoxia has followed the questions that have been posed in the Q&A of Zoom. Xiao, may I give you the floor, and the entire panel will be there to enter into the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica. Let's first start by combining a question by Erik van der Kooi and Peter Langenberg. They both have the same comment, which is that Europe is very slow to adapt its narrative to the changing world. And how much is it really a challenge that narratives have to be adapted to new and developing political realities? Take Corona, for example. If you already look at the European narrative, it started with a narrative of European integration based on no more war, but now the European Union has taken on more responsibilities. So how do you face these challenges?
Mark, maybe I can invite you to start answering this question. Mark Elchardus, you are still muted, Mark.
Yeah, I agree with one aspect of what was said in the question, and that is that narratives, of course, should not change too often. And the purpose of a narrative is that it's a long-range view of what a country stands for. But on the other hand, Europe has changed quite profoundly, and the world situation has changed. So I think that even certainly for the European Union, where we only are dealing with an emerging narrative and not a very clear, crystallized out narrative as, for instance, the Chinese is at this moment. So yes, we should work on this narrative, and working on a narrative. Monica indicated that already. It's not a marketing kind of thing. It's a narrative is where you take your fundamental, most strategic decisions and try to formulate them in a way that people can understand, that is mobilizing for the people you want to mobilize. And so I think our narrative in the near future, discussions about the narrative in the near future, should focus on what Frans-Paul signaled also. And this is this issue of human rights. I think we should really use the China case to ask ourselves, what's the best way to promote human rights? We are not going to invade China, that's clear. We are not going to uncouple completely from China, so sanctions also are limited. So what are we going to do? And I think we should try to raise that question in a very serious way. Also considering, I think that we maybe have been too enthusiastic about human rights in Europe the last years, because there are serious criticism that the human rights movement has not changed very much in the world. And, the Chinese have one argument. People suffer from being persecuted, but much more people suffer from poverty. And China is one of the countries who probably on that score has done most than any other country over the last 30 or 40 years or so. So I think we should have a very frank discussion about what is the role of human rights in our international policy. And that's going to be a very painful discussion, I think.
Yeah, I think several of you in the panel have already indicated that we are approaching this very painful discussion indeed. Xiao, are there any other questions that build on that maybe?
We have a question by Adriaan Schout on popular support for narratives. And Adriaan asks, can a narrative change create popular support and help to rally around the flag? And related to this, how should the European public participate in the creation of a narrative, and how to reach audiences abroad and at home?
Yeah, it was quite interesting. I found that Professor Zhang was mentioning and that the Chinese are relying much more than Western democracies on survey research. And so we have just elections that even result in the election of dumb people. They have election selection plus reliance on surveys. I know Mark Elchardus is the survey researcher, or maybe one of the others who wants to come in here. Survey results and narratives. Mark?
Well, very shortly, I think that survey research is underused in all democracies. All democracies have a problem. A lot of people complain that politics don't listen to them anymore. And I think we could have a much better view on what people feel and think and why they do so by doing serious survey research. So I'm all in favor of that. And I think it's necessary to develop a narrative. But of course, we should never fall for this Chinese confusion. Surveys are not elections. And they can't replace elections. And it's also so that politicians do not necessarily have to follow what the majority at one moment thinks. But I think it's very bad for a country if politicians don't know anymore what the majority of the people is thinking. That's very fatal for democracy.
Thanks, Mark. Xiao, what's up?
We have another question by Ramzi Tufik, who directs his question to Karin Mössenlechner. And he asks, how much can the Netherlands influence the European narrative and how, and what is it doing already? So what is the Dutch reflection on these questions?
Okay, I can see Mr. Elchardus already laughing. How much can the Dutch influence? Well, I think actually just by coming up with a China policy paper as a first, and by actually raising a discussion in the European Union about the Indo-Pacific, we have at least contributed to this discussion. And the interesting thing is, I think that at least in my circles of the directors of Asia, there is a very vivid discussion about the importance of a European narrative. And that's for a reason, because we see from our part of the world how important that is. And I think that part of the European discussion also started in this corner. So in the corner of the directors of Asia, who were raising the importance of this and the need for this. And also, I think the COVID crisis has been mentioned. Of course, the COVID crisis, especially in the beginning, has impacted us very negatively. It has sped up many developments in the world, but also the first response in Europe to COVID crisis, well, was something that actually raised a lot of questions in many parts of Asia. And we have to come up with actually stories, why we are doing what we're doing, and we have to explain better what we are, what we stand for. And we see also a call from other countries, also in Asia, to work closer together with Europe. When it comes to the ASEAN countries, for instance, they see in Europe a partner that they want to work together with when it comes to protecting a rules-based international order, when it comes to protecting also the economic standards. And they see in Europe also an example when it comes to standard setting. So I think from the Asia director angle we can contribute to this discussion in Europe and Netherlands as a whole as well. Although I don't think there is one vision in the Netherlands about what the European narrative should be. I think it's also important to have this discussion more in our own country and our own society, what we think should be the European narrative. And that also leads back to the question about the surveys, making sure that we involve the population in this discussion as well, and not just having it at a high abstract level.
Yeah, thanks, Karin. Shao?
Thank you. We have a question by Mitte de Boon specifically on Corona, and she asks, how can aid assistance narratives be part of the more wider geopolitical narratives of both the EU and China, especially considering Corona? And how have these narratives touched down on the recipients of aid in, for example, the African continent? So how do we see the return of Corona in narratives of aid in Europe and China?
Frans-Paul, you want to come in on this one?
Sure. I think China has used this in a way to create a challenge for us, because it's not just specific Corona aid, but I think because it's embedded in a more general Chinese approach towards development and towards relationships with developing countries, where China has built a story, a narrative that says that after many decades of Western, European or American development support, development aid, not much progress has been made in many parts of the world. And new actors, of course, like China itself, in this narrative, are able to break that status quo and to actually give a strong new push to development. This is also part of the, central part of this Chinese narrative is actually the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So we have seen this also, return last year and this year in China's relations with developing countries with regard to Corona aid. And so this in fact creates a challenge because quite, implicitly, strongly, but also at some points, some moments explicitly, China is saying, well, the European countries have not been able to deliver, and so how are we going to respond to this? And of course, this response is under development, is there, but I think it's a big challenge that still maybe needs even some more efforts on the European side.
Karin, you want to add to that?
Yes, because I agree with the Frans-Paul that this is indeed the picture that exists. On the other hand, I think the European Union is the largest contributor to the COVAX coalition worldwide, looking at a global distribution and also a fair distribution to the poorest countries. And of course, we are not there yet, but we are doing an enormous job as a European Union to work to provide the COVID vaccines to all the countries in need. And we have not been as visible in this exercise as some other countries. But I think the European Union also has learned, because we've planted more flags than ever now with the arrival of COVAX vaccines. And it goes maybe a bit against our own idea of how we should do this and how we should do, also how should deal with development aid. But we see the need also to become a little bit more visible. And I think with European Union now actually showing more clearly what they are doing and also continuing what they are doing, I think we have come a long way during this COVID crisis.
Thanks. There's an interesting parallel as Clingendael colleagues who were closely involved in the debates in the run-up to the Dutch-China note. And at like 99% of the development of that note, someone said, "Where's the US?" And it's a bit happening in this discussion as well. I see Paul in the call with no questions yet. Xiao, are there questions that address, the US in this geopolitical triangle or how is Europe seen in the relationship with the US? Is the US among your questions?
Yes, we have a question by Steven Langenboom. who mentions increased intra-EU cooperation on China, and we can bring in the US on this. What is the narrative of American cooperation with other like-minded states on China? And how does this work, for example, in the United Nations?
Paul, please, bring in the US.
Sure. Yeah, let me tie a few things here together here. I think also, just to build on the idea that the US must lead, kind of have to go back and understand that in the US national narrative, which doesn't have, unlike most countries, it doesn't have really an ethnic origin or an ethnic myth, right? It's really one of a liberal fragment, right? Jill Lepore has argued this, Louis Hartz has argued this. And it is kind of framed always or historically it was framed in opposition to Europe, right? The escape from European power politics and religious intolerance and all these other narratives, right? And that has been strengthened by the experiences of the 20th century. So Europeans are not only must the US lead, the Europeans are unable to, right? And what was interesting about that is that you can kind of see that still in effect. It's hard to look at what the US did a few weeks ago with France and not think that despite France doing exactly what fit the larger policy agenda of the US, to kind of see that as still irrelevant to what the US wanted to do, to the US seeing itself as having to play the central role. So in terms of cooperation with the international agenda, that's actually going to prove a lot more difficult than it might seem, despite, at least with this administration, mostly overlapping values. There's a story here within American thinking that however much, and I've noticed this in interviews, I've noticed this in every kind of conversation, however much Europeans are considered sympathetic, not by everyone, right? But when they're not necessarily seen as being, independent, as it's not necessarily seen as a good thing if they are independent players, if they have their own story. And those things also, to make the circle complete, if the European narrative is one of no more war, which I think is a fair way to talk about the common identity as it emerged after the war in the 50s, 60s, and afterwards, it is complementary to the idea that the US must lead. The US must lead because Europeans screwed up so badly. And Europeans believe that to a large extent as well. So also a lot of this idea of US values as being universal, as being transnational, and not even really defined, not specifically located in the US, is also actually accepted by Europeans. So that also creates another impediment beyond US resistance, creates another impediment for the European narrative to emerge.
Yeah. What we found in our foreign policy survey, the Clingendael Barometer, is that there is one point where the Dutch public does not follow the US, and that is in a confrontation with China. And so if you ask the question, in a potential future Cold War between the US and China, would you follow China? I think 4% would, still remarkable. And would you follow the US is also a minority, but a majority does not want to choose. So there's divergence, where it comes to the American grand strategy narrative and how the European public sees the future.
Right. Well, I think that's the same also with policymakers, right? You can see these contradictions in Dutch policy documents. You can see them most prominently, I think, in German policy statements.
Yeah.
Right. There's no alternative to the transatlantic relationship.
No.
Yet anything that really would give a little bit of punch, a little bit of assertiveness to a European foreign policy is also looked at with great suspicion, if not extreme trepidation. So there's that contradiction there, but there's the contradictions in US foreign policy as well. These strategic narratives are attempts to make things coherent, but clearly, they keep bumping up with actual reality. Yeah. They're not, they're still stories.
Yeah. And also temporary solutions of political conflicts on grand strategy, because it's not about storytelling only, it's also political conflict about the political direction that is preferable. Thank you so much. A lot to reflect on. I want to introduce now, as a conclusion of this panel, my also very talented colleague, Ties Dams. I'm so happy to have these two here in the room. Ties Dams will conclude this session with a column. Ties, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And already mentioned by Karin, well worth the read. I will start by mentioning an article, an interview by Der Spiegel with Christoph Heusgen, Merkel's top foreign policy advisor for the past 12 years, who was asked by Der Spiegel whether Afghanistan was a defeat for the West. His answer was most telling. I have actually, he said, eliminated the term the West from my vocabulary. Now, the West has been our hero, the protagonist of a story that promises the victory of a universal normative order over the chaos of ideological division. In Heusgen's eyes, Afghanistan isn't just a battle lost or a treasure stolen. Rather, it is one event in a series of disenchantments that have, in his eyes, invalidated the very character, our hero, the West. Now, his analysis isn't wrong. He provides 3 reasons for giving up on the West. 1 from the East, 1 from within the West, and 1 from Europe an sich. Let's consider them in that order. Heusgen argues that nowadays, the West is merely a strategic fiction most potently put to use by our Eastern adversaries, Russia and China. The West, he argues, serves as a battle cry of resistance for the rest. He's perfectly right. China and Russia use the West as a useful adversary to rally against. Countries of the rest unite against the West. The West in this story is a yester world, a civilization in decay, hubristic and lazy. This particular story of the West is deployed successfully in, for instance, China's strategic communications to Africa and Russia's to the European neighborhood. More troublingly, it resonates with some European leaders. Orban comes to mind, and with the left and right extremes of some European electorates. This story is the real punch of Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns to fortify the false prophets of Western division and decay. Its real power lies in amplifying the already existing vulnerabilities in the image of the West, both abroad and at home. Now, if this is the challenge, the question becomes what narrative may meet it? Fact-checking pieces of disinformation won't do much to counter Russia and China, but is giving up on our hero, the West, any better? Now, Biden, for one, seems to have his answer ready. He's doubling down on American leadership. This, too, makes for an ambiguous relation to our hero, the West. Biden reclaims American global leadership, but in a particular way. There are 2 worlds, he says, democratic and authoritarian, and only one can survive. Under American leadership, not Western, mind you, the democratic world has a fighting chance. Although the transatlantic agendas converge on many issues related to China, European and American views of what kind of character China is in their respective stories are utterly different. To US elites, China is an existential threat. To European elites, it's a fact in a flawed world. Now, a question lingers in European capitals. Has Biden maybe also given up on the West? And if not Biden, what will become of the West after a coming election? What will become of it when tensions in the Indo-Pacific heat up? Now, animosity in the East and ambiguity in the West. These are 2 of the reasons to give up on our hero. The third comes from Europe itself. Heusgen argues Europe does not need the West. Our values, he says, are universal and ought never be constrained by spheres of influence. The liberal international order should stand proud of its universal claim. Although comfortable, his response does not seem adequate in real life. In fact, as he himself argues, it's exactly the universality of values that China successfully undermines, more than the values themselves. It's the gap between what the West promises, the universal, and the reality of its geopolitics, contested, that China exploits. This too is the source of American ambiguity, the constant struggle in Washington between realism and idealism. Biden's Afghanistan policy, if anything, has proven that American realism is stronger than ever, despite his Manichaean rhetoric. More fundamentally, I believe, Huygens fails to appreciate the fundamental power of narrative in our politics. Narrative is not what we do, it's what we are. Necessarily, narratives only function within a unity of time, place, and action, a maxim already pointed out by Aristotle. Universalism, transcending time, place, and action, is a poor narrative backbone. If Europe is to save the liberal international order, it needs a when, a where, and a why. It needs a story, and it needs a hero. Interestingly, as surveys show, this is exactly what European electorates are calling for. Europe as a power bloc to temper Sino-US rivalry and protect European institutions. Scrapping words from our dictionary isn't good enough anymore. Giving up on our hero isn't good enough either. We need new ones. Hearing the contributions of the eminent speakers before me, I draw a number of lessons that the poets of European politics, the poets that will take Huygens' place in months to come, should heed. 1. The very fact of China's ascent undermines the universalism it takes offense with. American ambiguity towards the West makes for an undependable defense. 2, the geopolitical playing field will be thus. A number of great powers will vie for influence by telling their stories to the world. The battle of narratives will be a fact of life for decades to come. 3, others will tell Europe's story for it if it doesn't tell it itself. And given the current escalation between China and the US, this is becoming an increasingly risky outlook. 4, Europe must simultaneously relearn the grammar of geopolitics and the power of narrative, abroad and at home. We must speak of what Europe has been, what it will be, and to what end. Autonomy isn't enough. History, identity, and diversity should be central to the stories we tell to other great powers. 5, the return of Manichaean narratives of a world of good and evil with absolute divisions and absolute loyalties is a fiction, and indeed a threat. Actually, it's exactly the kind of threat that European leaders could recognize as a call to adventure, as a start of a new hero's journey. If anything, European civilization was forged out of the catastrophes of great power conflict. The very existence of Europe proves it is possible to overcome it. The Europe that defends its values from the ultimate consequences of hegemonic strife. If not the West, let that be our hero.
Thank you, Thies. Thanks a lot. And we will definitely return to these points in, for instance, the panel that we will have on security narratives for a geopolitical union. And I want to invite you to join those panels. We will now try to use the elements that we've gathered in these 2 scene-setting panels in the strategic debates in 4 policy domains: industrial policies, security policy, climate change, climate policies, and policies vis-a-vis the Eurozone. And there we will have, all the time this great power narrative context and the diversity within the European Union that European narratives have to deal with. And I want to thank the eminent panel here. I want to thank my young colleagues, Thies Dams and Sjousje Martin, and the audience for their active participation. Please tune in again tomorrow. We will start in a long tradition at Clingendael to have the European presidency here. In this case, the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the European Union, Gaspar Dovčan, State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia, with the presidency's narrative. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.